On June
Attorney
1st,
General
I
Barr,
was
you
worried
seem
about
to
the
be
District of
engaging
Columbia,
in
which is
protests
federal.
in certain parts of the country. You're very aware of those, but when protesters with guns and swastikas and
I am
Confederate
aware of
flags, excuse me,
protesters in
Mr.
the
Barr, this
federal
is my
government.
time and I control it. You are aware of certain kinds of protesters, but in Michigan, when protesters carry guns and Confederate flags and swastikas and call for the governor of Michigan to be beheaded and shot and lynched, somehow you're not aware of that. Somehow you didn't know about it, so you didn't send federal agents in to do to the president's supporters what you did to the president's protesters. In fact, you didn't put pepper balls on those protesters. So the point I'm trying to make here, Mr. Barr, that I think is very important for the country to understand, is that there is a real discrepancy in how you react as the Attorney General, the top cop in this country, when white men with swastikas storm a government building with guns. There is no need for the president to, quote, activate you because they're getting the president's personal agenda done. But when black people and people of color protest police brutality, systemic racism, and the president's very own lack of response to those critical issues, then you forcibly remove them with armed federal officers, pepper bombs, because they are considered terrorists by the president. You take an aggressive approach to Black Lives Matter protests, but not to right-wing extremists threatening to lynch a governor if it's for the president's benefit. Did I get it right, Mr. Barr?
And there we saw Representative Pramila Jayapal absolutely roasting and ripping apart A.G. Barr. Of course, the point she makes is a very valid point, and it's a point that I'm glad that she brought up, and one that I hadn't really thought much about, but I'm glad that now that she's brought it up, I get to speak on it. And that is the hypocrisy of this administration and its approach to different protests that have happened in the United States since the COVID-19 crisis began. See, after COVID-19 hit the United States and states started shutting down, counties started shutting down, and let's face it, the country started shutting down, we had a lot of very interesting protests pop up. These protests were generally right-wing for a good majority of them. They were end the shutdown protests. They were storming courthouses. They were taking stands with guns in courthouses, and as you heard Mrs. Jayapal, or Representative Jayapal say, they were calling for the execution of governors. Ironically, though, they did not find themselves getting beaten down by feds. Ironically, they didn't find themselves getting pepper sprayed. They didn't find themselves getting hit with pepper balls. They didn't find themselves being tear gassed. In fact, the police stood by idly and watched. In fact, the federal agents stood by idly and watched. In fact, they allowed it to happen. But as we see, with protests like in Portland and New York and Philadelphia, Chicago, New Mexico, and all over the country, Black Lives Matter protests are met with a very different response. And of course, we have to discuss this for a reason. Because right now, what is showing is the bias in Donald Trump's agenda. What's showing is A.G. Barr's bias towards what the agenda of the administration is. See, the agenda of the administration is to circumvent the powers of the lower levels of government. See, the lower levels of government have the power to shut down their state. The lower levels of government have the power to shut down their towns. And see, Donald Trump wants to circumvent that. And instead of circumventing that via presidential executive orders or any other powers that he may have, he just allowed A.G. Barr to sit idly and allow these protests to happen. He decided to sit idly and allow people to make threats against the lives of governors. He decided to sit idly as these men marched with, as I talked about in a previous video, absolutely ineffective tactical gear. But Black Lives Matter, that is a big thing for him. And the whole movement against systemic racism, against symbols of racism in this country's past and present, that's a problem for him. And then, of course, being that it's a problem for him, it's a problem for A.G. Barr. And see, A.G. Barr is forced to take a stand. AG Barr is forced to take action because it is a problem for the administration, therefore a problem for his boss, and a threat to his job stability. See, the Trump administration has an agenda. Their agenda is quite simple. It's become very clear, more clear than it ever was. Their agenda is to pander to the white supremacists. Their agenda is to pander to the white nationalists. Their agenda is to pander to anybody who claims the Confederate flag or the Confederacy as heritage. Their agenda is to pander to the All Lives crowd, All Lives Matter crowd, and the Back the Blue Line crowd. Because by pandering to them, he's igniting a fire in the base that has supported him more than anything. Now, when Donald Trump talks about a silent majority, part of that he's not too wrong on. The major part of his support base for a long time was a silent minority in this country. He calls them a majority because even though they are silent and a minority in this country, by calling them a majority, it makes them feel stronger than they are. It makes their movement feel more organized. It makes their movement feel like it has vigor behind it. Donald Trump is playing the typical word game to his cult. Now, this word game expands outside of pandering to this crowd. It expands outside of that. He has to play the word game in a very specific way. See, last night Donald Trump put out a tweet, and that tweet, he talked about how the protesters in Portland specifically, they are not peaceful protesters. They are agitators and anarchists. They are criminal. He's downplaying the significance of their lives. And therefore, the thing that most people aren't going to connect, he's also downplaying the significance of the lives those people are protesting next to. See, what he's doing is he's making the choice to murder or inflict violence on a protester less of a hard one. See, when his supporters view a Black Lives Matter protester or someone who calls themselves an anarchist or someone who identifies as anti-fascist or even identifies as being against Trump, what he's doing is he's downplaying the significance of their lives. He's making his cult and his support base intrinsically value their lives less than anybody else's. And therefore, it becomes a lot easier for him to get his base to enact the violence he seeks to see. See, violence against them, it adds to the fire. Violence against these protesters, in his mind, is going to get them to stop. It's going to enact fear in them. But as we are seeing in Portland, between Donald Trump's tactics, sending the feds in, kidnapping people, and rummaging through their personal belongings and violating their rights, we are seeing it have the direct opposite impact. Now, the dangerous part of this, as I spoke about last night, is this could get radically violent. This could get very dangerous very quick and lead to a lot of bloodshed. And this is where we as the protesters, we as the people out there doing activism need to be insanely careful and very methodical in what we do. See, we cannot put ourselves in risk of violence, so we must always be at the ready. We cannot put ourselves at risk of personal injury, so we must always be at the ready for that. So, what do we do? Well, despite the things we've seen happen where, in the example, Garrett Foster brought his weapon with him in order to protect himself, his fiance, and those around him, despite the fact that we know the right wing and the white nationalists will try to flip anything we do in order to protect ourselves against us, we must carry. We must carry weapons in preparation of defense of ourselves. Because what we're seeing is, as I said, the intrinsic value of our lives being diminished. We're witnessing our lives and the lives of anybody that identifies even similar to us become less valuable. So we must be prepared to protect ourselves, to protect those around us, and to protect our personal friends and family, and be prepared to have our names drug even by allies. See, to be a voice of liberty and to awaken the voice of liberty here in America right now requires us to not value the memory of our own being. Because the people that will remember us for who we are, they're our closest allies right now. Those who we ally with by party affiliation, they're not always going to be there. So take the stand. Do not let your life be valued less. Do not allow a president to force your life to become less valuable than anyone around you, and continue that fight to ensure that black lives do matter. Be sure to continue that fight to increase the value of every other life that is not a white life until all lives matter equally in the eyes of society and in the eyes of justice. Then we don't have to worry about attorney generals like Barr, who crack down on Black Lives Matter protests harder than they do on ours. That's what we have to fight for. So go forward and be a voice of liberty, and continue the fight and awaken the voice of liberty in others, because that's how the change begins.